Hegel. Hegel. We're really going to talk about Hegel. Oh, okay. Maybe I could talk about Schopenhauer or maybe Kant's critique of judgment. I don't know. I'm more of a Thomas Aquinas guy myself, but I really do have some serious questions for you, Paul. And I do understand the distinction between the illustrative and the decorative. Okay, and how illustration is part of art. It's a deep part of that tradition, okay? At the same time, okay? Now, and this is just from my perspective, because of my training as an architect. So I was trained in kind of like in the so I went to architectural school from 1984 to 1989. And this is the height of this was really when the transition in at least architecture, there was a lot of discussion about the transition from modernism to postmodernism, okay? And I was going to the Illinois Institute of Technology, which is a bastion of the Mies van der Rohe school of modernist architecture. We're talking, Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, international style, all the way, all the theory that supports it, okay? Not just like, okay, this is how to do, less is more, right? And with less is more being justified by, John Ruskin's 7 Lamps of Architecture and having to do with, honesty in architecture and all that kind of stuff. And then, just things that are peculiar to architecture, right? And architectural theory, like Louis Kahn, talking about, asking the brick what the brick wants to be and in the nature of materials and all that kind of stuff, all right? So there was this kind of like modernist universalizing tendency that they were somehow tapping into universal principles, okay? And that kind of leaked over into their painting theory. So like when they talked about, and presented art theory, we talked about Kandinsky and all that development through the modern period, but it was through this kind of technological lens of architecture and the transition from modernist ideas that there's a universal, international, generic human that, matches industrial culture perfectly, Corbusier's perfect man, perfectly proportioned man. I mean, it and how that influenced even like Mata and some of the paintings, because Mata was a draftsman for Le Corbusier, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's this whole discussion about painting is something is not part of that, okay? It's pre-industrial. And so when I was learning to paint and I was learning aesthetics and I was learning all these things about what it means to be a modern human being, all right, a modern practitioner of the art of architecture. It was all Mies van der Rohe, it was all Frank Lloyd Wright, it was all these great masters of modernism, all right? But there's also this undercurrent of postmodernism. Even I would go to like these lectures at the Art Institute of Chicago, and it would be Jacques Derrida and whatnot. And, the talking about semiotics and various theories about, authority and authorship, grand narratives, et cetera, blah, 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 blah. Bullshit. All right. So I'm taking all this in, and for some god-awful reason, I decided I wanted to learn to paint. And my role models were things like, it's almost embarrassing. Frank Frazetta, okay? Just like, wow. If I could paint like Frank Frazetta and just like imagine a world and just bring it to existence, wow, that would be amazing. And so, I decided I wanted to learn to paint for whatever reason. And I was actually trained in a very traditional way by Dominic Vignola, who taught and who was a student of Joseph Allworthy, who had studied adjacent to Max Meldrum, the Australian painter, in the studio of Carola Strand. Okay, so for what it's worth, I think it's kind of bullshit, but I have pedigree, right? I've been classically trained, and specifically, if you look at Max Meldrum, we're talking about depiction. All right, so this is actually kind of like where the rubber hits the road with Paul, I think. We're talking about illusion. We're talking about decorative aspects. We're talking about the illustrative aspects. And I think one of the things that I question as a modern human being is this lack of narrative, this inability to, if the painting is complete, right? The flea market test, right? Somebody who knows nothing about the painting, right? And they find it at a flea market, do they value it, right? Does it have value to them? And, to me, I don't think it should have value just because it shows the Virgin Mary, or, because it, shows the Chicago skyline, whatever. There's something else there. And it's not just the decorative, okay? And I'm self-aware enough to understand that it could very well be that whatever I'm experiencing, is just common, right? It's nothing special, and that's okay, But it's my special. I'm telling it to you. That's kind of all I really want to do. But how do I do that without conventions? Okay, for example, let's talk about the Middle Ages, right? St. Peter is the guy holding the keys, St. Luke's got a pen, all this kind of stuff, right? The learning to read these symbols, right? But you got to know the symbols, all right? So this is something external to painting that you got to know, that you got to bring from yourself to the painting before you can understand the painting. And yet a lot of that stuff's lost to us, I look at a lot of old paintings and there's stuff in there. I know it means something, but it doesn't mean anything to me. At the same time, I can be moved by that. Does that make any sense? What makes sense of that? It's not about illusion. It's not about suggestion. It's not. That's the deep mystery of painting, I think. I don't know. What do you think, Paul? There's something there. There's something. I think illustration is when you bring something to the painting, and I want to know what the painting can carry by itself. That's the bottom line. What can the painting carry by itself from one human being to another, okay, in the most basic and direct fashion? Assuming they don't know the symbols, assuming they don't know, I mean, I want somebody to be able to move around in a visual playground and just have a good time looking at the painting. And I don't care if it's a landscape or a multi-figures or whatever. I want somebody to just sit there, look at it, and have a good time. I think that'd be really cool. I wish I could do more of that. Occasionally, I almost get it. It's just a little beyond me. God, I want it so bad.